We shall move to questions without notice. Are there any questions? I'll give the call to the honourable member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. Given that the Albanese Labor government is refusing to release its 2035 emissions reduction target before the next election, can the government guarantee that Australians will not face an increase in energy prices as a result of Labor's secret target?
Order. No. The Acting Prime Minister will pause. Not sure if everyone has forgotten how question time should be operating, but that was an example of how it shouldn't be being conducted. So, we'll start strong this week. The member for Lindsay will begin her question again. There won't be commentary, there won't be remarks, there won't be add-ons, because I can't hear what she's saying, and she's earned the right to ask her question in silence. So the member for Lindsay has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. Given that the Albanese Labor government is refusing to release its 2035 emissions reduction target before the next election, can the government guarantee that Australians will not face an increase in energy prices as a result of Labor's secret target?
Call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the member for her question. Since coming to government, what this government has understood is that the cheapest form of energy today is renewable energy, which is why we have increased renewables in the grid by 25%. And we are, in doing so, on target to both putting downward pressure on energy prices but also meeting our emissions reduction target by 2030. But one thing that I can absolutely guarantee is that the $600 billion plan that the Leader of the Opposition has to introduce nuclear power into Australia's electricity grid will absolutely increase energy prices, because what this man is doing and what those opposite are doing is doubling down on the single most expensive form of electricity which exists in the world today. And what we see is the prospect of households paying $1,200 a year more by virtue of the—
Order. Members on my left will cease objecting. I'd like to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Well, Mr Speaker, on relevance, a very tight question. Can the government guarantee that Australians will not face an increase in energy prices as a result of Labor's secret target? If the Acting Prime Minister cannot give that guarantee, he should sit down. What he's saying now is not relevant.
The Acting Prime Minister is able to compare and contrast to some degree, but for the remainder 1 minute 50 he won't simply be able to talk about the opposition's policy because he wasn't asked about alternative approaches. He can do some compare and contrast, but I'm going to draw him back to the question.
Speaker, I thank the Speaker. What we face is the prospect of what policies are on offer and what policies we reject. And one of the critical policies which is being put forward by those opposite is in respect of nuclear power, and that is a policy that we will not pursue because we will be focused on increasing more renewables into the grid. And so the prospect which those opposite are suggesting, which will not see any new electricity in the grid for many, many years to come, and at its peak will represent about 4% of the energy grid, is a prospect that we will completely reject. This government, each and every day, has been focused on energy bills for the Australian people. That's why we provided energy relief to every household around the country. We did so in the face of the opposition of this man. We did so in the face of the opposition of those opposite. So what I can guarantee to the honourable member is that in the Albanese government there is a government which will be focused each and every day on reducing the energy prices, putting downward pressure on the energy prices of Australian households.
The member for Page will cease interjecting. So I can hear from the member for Swan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government working for Australians to bring down cost of living pressures, and what would the impact be if some of those measures were not delivered?
Call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. Global inflation in the aftermath of the pandemic and with conflicts in different parts of the world is impacting every nation. Wherever you go, there are communities around the world which are feeling the pinch, and that is no different here in Australia. We know that Australians are doing it tough. We know there is more to be done. What we offer is a government which is utterly focused each and every day on the household budgets of every Australian. Now, when we came to power, we understood that the most important step that we could take in the war on inflation was prudent economic management, which is why in our 2 years in office we have produced 2 surpluses, putting downward pressure on inflation. And, Mr Speaker, that is starting to work. Because what we inherited from those opposite was an inflation rate of 6.1%. Indeed, in their last full quarter in office, the quarterly inflation rate was 2.1%, the highest this century. And now the inflation rate is down to 2.8% annually within the RBA band. Now, our economic management stands in stark contrast to those opposite, who in every one of their 9 attempts failed to produce a surplus, despite promising it on each and every occasion. They had no idea how to manage the budget. There was never an issue that they wouldn't throw money at. Whatever Robert Menzies or John Howard might have imagined for their party, the sad truth is that for this bunch of Liberals, economic management is not their strong suit, which is why the biggest risk to the household budgets of every Australian is the prospect of a future Dutton government. Now, when we have spent money, we have been focused on cost of living relief, such as tax cuts for all, increasing the minimum wage. But that has been done in the face of the opposition of this man, and if the Leader of the Opposition had had his way, the average household in this country would now be $7,000 worse off. And the only idea that they have in terms of budget management is $315 billion worth of cuts. That's the age pension, that's bulk billing, that's Medicare. So Australians should be under no illusion whatsoever. The single biggest risk to their household budget, the single biggest risk to their future, Mr Speaker, is sitting right there.
Before I call the member for Fairfax, I've got the call. The member for Latrobe was not interjecting, he was yelling all throughout question time. If I can hear you from that far away, I can only imagine how loud it was disruptive for members around you. Order. Members on my right. So the member for Latrobe will leave the chamber under 94A. I'm just going to ask all members, I know it's first day back, it's a big fortnight, but I want everyone to show some restraint today and to show each other more respect. The call to the honourable member for Fairfax.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Acting Prime Minister. The Albanese Labor government has claimed its renewables-only plan would cost $122 billion, but the real price tag is over $642 billion. That's more than 5 times as expensive. Why is this weak and incompetent Labor government hiding the true cost from Australian families who will have to foot the bill for its renewables-only plan?
Order. The Treasurer will cease interjecting. The Minister for Infrastructure and the Minister for Environment shall also join him and otherwise will be warned. The Acting Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. But I definitely do not accept the assertions which are contained in the body of that question. What is clear in the world today, whether those opposite understand it or not, is that the cheapest form of electricity is renewable electricity. And that's why we have got the renewable sector going again, something which those opposite did their best to absolutely crush, something that in the process of which those opposite were doing everything they could to see an upward pressure on energy prices in this country. But we have got investment in renewables going again such that there is a 25% increase in the grid. Now, we are doing that in terms of putting downward pressure on energy prices. What those opposite have to offer is a $600 billion nuclear plan which will cost Australian households an additional $1,200 a year, because it is understood around the world to be the single most expensive form of energy in the world today. And there is no prospect of that energy coming onto the grid for years and years to come, and when it does, it will represent about 4% of the electricity grid. So that is what is being offered by those opposite. I mean, there is a head stuck in the sand by literally every single one of those on the other side. They refuse to acknowledge modernity in terms of walking down the path of renewable energy. They are busily trying to discover bronze, and in the process— The
Acting Prime Minister will pause. The member for Fairfax on a point of order.
Speaker, point of order is on relevance. The question went to the Acting Prime Minister, pointing out the difference between their claim of a $122 billion cost and the real cost of $642 billion. And the question was, why are they hiding this true cost from Australian families who will have to pay for it?
Resume your seat.
He hasn't answered that question.
Yeah. The Acting Prime Minister, I listened carefully at the beginning, said that he rejected the assertions in the question, so he obviously doesn't agree with the proposition, and he's outlining why he's disagreeing with it. He needs to stay on the topic. He can't, as I've warned him already, he can't veer into alternative policies for the entire answer. But if he's disagreeing with what you're suggesting, he's going to outline to the House why that is the case. The Acting Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This government is committed to having our nation climb the technological ladder and face modernity by having a transition to net zero emissions by 2050 and having more renewables in the grid in a way which is completely firmed. That's what we are doing, because that is what every responsible economy on the planet is doing. And the only other option that you hear in the developed world, literally, is from those opposite, which is talking about establishing a civil nuclear industry from scratch at an enormous cost to Australian households, and that is a policy we will not pursue.
Call to the member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Speaker. And my question's to the Treasurer. What action is the Albanese Labor government taking so Australians can continue to pay cash for essential items? And how does this approach differ from alternatives?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank and acknowledge the member for Newcastle for her focus, which is shared by every member of this side of the House, on the cost of living pressures that people in her community are under, and as part of that, making sure that people can continue to pay cash for essential items if they need to and if they want to. And here as well, Mr Speaker, I want to shout out the work of the Assistant Treasurer. He and I have been working together very closely to make sure that as we modernise our payment system, we make sure that as we're phasing out cheques, we do it with a long run-up, and that we also make sure that there's an ongoing role for cash in our economy when it comes to essential items. Now, we know the direction of travel in the economy is that more and more people want to pay digitally, but there are still 1.5 million Australians who do most of their payments via cash, more than 80% of their payments by cash. 1.5 million Australians. And so what we want to do, Mr Speaker, as the Leader of the Opposition again fails to engage in a meaningful way on anything to do with the economy, is what we want to do is we want to make sure that people can continue to pay cash for essential items if they want to or they need to.
Order.
We understand, even if those opposite don't, that cash can be a really important lifeline. Cash can be an important backup. Cash can give people a sense of security, a sense of peace of mind, knowing that they have cash there as a backup, and we want to maintain that as an option and as an ongoing feature of our economy. So, Mr Speaker, we intend to do what a lot of other countries have done and what a lot of states and jurisdictions in the US have done, and that is to mandate make sure that cash is acceptable when people are buying things from supermarkets or whether it's the pharmacy or petrol stations and in other ways. Now, Mr Speaker, you would think that those opposite would enthusiastically support our efforts to give people that peace of mind, but sadly no. Sadly no. We know from Senator Hume this morning that those opposite don't support our efforts to maintain an ongoing role for cash in our economy. She made that clear. And so what that means, Mr Speaker, the logical conclusion of that is that those opposite are a risk to cash in our economy in the same way that this opposition leader is a risk to household budgets more broadly, Mr Speaker. And we know that they're a risk because we know their record when it comes to Medicare, when it comes to housing, when it comes to wages, and now when it comes to a role for cash in the economy as an important backup, Mr Speaker. He is a risk, this opposition leader, to household budgets because we know his record and we know that his reckless arrogance would set Australians back in tangible ways. We're in the third year of a three-year parliamentary term. They know that they're against everything that this government proposes, Mr Speaker, but they still haven't come up with anything credible, coherent or costed by way of economic policy.
Before I call the member for Indi, I just have a number of announcements to make to the House. I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the Special Visitors Gallery today is a delegation of female leaders from wiser Pacifica communities, whose organisation aims to empower the next generation of Pacifica people. I'm also pleased to inform the House that present in the Southern Gallery today are members of the Australian Defence Force personnel participating in the Parliamentary exchange element of the ADF-PP. And also we have a number of state representatives with us today, including Ms Emma Bullen, the member for Pakenham in the Victorian Legislative Assembly, and members from the New South Wales Parliament, Mr Dougal Saunders, the Honourable Sarah Mitchell MLC and Mr Brendan Moylan. I'm also pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today is Her Excellency Ms Anne Greta Riche, the Ambassador of Norway, and with us today is representatives from the exercise and active health sector who, in collaboration with the Parliamentary Gym, will be launching AusActive's Fit for Office competition tomorrow as guests of the member for Bisha, and also the former member of Victorian Parliament, Don Kilgore, and his wife Cheryl are with us today. Welcome to you all. Give the call to the honourable member for Indi.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the member for Kooyong, under Standing Order 99. I refer to Private Members' Business, Order of the Day number 4, Lobbying, Improving Government Honesty and Trust Bill 2024, standing in the member's name. Can the member tell the House why debate on this bill should be resumed urgently and what process is needed for the House to fully consider this bill and ensure that it is passed?
Under the standing orders, the question is permissible under Standing Order 99. And I give the call to the honourable member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Speaker. And I thank the member for Indi for her question. She has asked about my private member's bill entitled Lobbying, Improving Government Honesty and Truth, also known as the Clean Up Politics Act. This bill introduces several measures to improve trust in government decision-making. These include extension of the register of lobbyists, publication of ministers' diaries, and closure of the revolving door between ministries and the private sector.
Order. Members on my right. The member will continue.
The member asked whether there is urgency in debating this bill, and there is. I first placed this bill before the House last year. It was not debated. With the help of Senator David Pocock, we secured a Senate inquiry into the bill. That received 346 submissions but received only a single day of hearings. That inquiry concluded that the government should improve its regulation of lobbyist activities in this House. The government has not done so, and it has not indicated any plan to do so. In this 47th Parliament, the member for Indi and many of my crossbench colleagues have placed integrity measures before this House. Bills to stop pork barrelling, bills for truth in political advertising, bills for meaningful and equitable reform of electoral donations. We've seen what goes on with that. Bills to stop jobs for mates, bills to protect whistleblowers, Not one of those bills has been debated by this government. Like me, the member was elected in 2022 because her community said that it wanted greater transparency, integrity and honesty in government.
The member must confirm her remarks to timing and procedure. You are weighing into commentary now, so I'm just going to return you back to the question, and under the standing orders there is limited scope for you to answer the question, so it must refer to timing and procedure.
Okay. Thank you, Speaker. Standing Order 99 permits members to ask when bills might be debated. This government has not debated a single private member's bill in this 47th parliament. I want to reverse the onus, Speaker, and I want to ask the government. I want to ask the acting Prime Minister and the Attorney-General when they will act.
Order. Order. Members on my right, the member for McEwen.
I would like them to tell my electorate and the electorates of the other members of the crossbench when and how they are going to take action to restore Australia's faith in the integrity, transparency and honesty of its government.
Call to the honourable member for Tangney.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Housing. How is the Albanese Labor government's plan to build 1.2 million homes helping Australians with housing costs? What is standing in the way?
Call to the Minister for Housing and the Minister for Homelessness.
Thank you so much, Speaker, and I want to thank the fantastic member for Tangney for his question. He's just a brilliant representative for his community. Speaker, the Albanese government has the boldest and most ambitious housing agenda that the Commonwealth has had for decades, a landmark $32 billion to help Australians manage this huge problem in our lives. We're helping Australians build, we're helping get a better deal for renters, and we're helping more Australians realise the dream of home ownership. Now, Speaker, as the member suggested, building more homes is at the very centre of our agenda because more homes means more affordable housing for Australians. And all of us in this chamber know that there are a lot of people in our communities doing it tough. All of us in this chamber have met families who are moving their kids from rental to rental, some of them having to disrupt the school year while they do it. We've got working families with mortgages who are really feeling the pressure, and a whole generation of young people out there who are increasingly saying to us that they feel that home ownership is out of reach for them permanently. It's not good for them and it's not good for the country. Now, Speaker, when we came to office 2.5 years ago on housing, the cupboard was absolutely bare. There was a lack of Commonwealth ambition, there was a lack of Commonwealth action, and for most of that time there was a lack of Commonwealth Housing Minister, Speaker. So the Albanese government stepped strongly into that void and, through our Prime Minister, negotiated an ambitious target of building 1.2 million homes over 5 years. Now, Speaker, we're working with the states and territories to make it easier to build homes. We're funding infrastructure to unlock greenfield sites. We're training more tradies to build those homes, with more than 35,000 construction-related courses being taken up through fee-free TAFE. We've expanded home ownership opportunities, with more than 130,000 Australians helped into home ownership since we've been in office. And we're supporting the construction of more social and affordable homes. Speaker, you might have missed this one, but when we announced the first round of the Housing Australia Future Fund announcement, just in round one alone, we will build more social and affordable homes than the Coalition did in their entire decade in office, Speaker. Now, this is a problem 30 years in the making, Speaker. It's not going to get solved overnight. But what you have here in Canberra is a government with fierce resolve. We are throwing everything we can at this problem, and we're making real progress in the face of very significant opposition, which no doubt you can hear coming from them right now, Speaker. There's going to be a real choice at the next election when it comes to housing. An opposition whose nasty negativity and reckless arrogance has probably affected housing policy as much as any issue facing the country. We're in the middle of a massive transformation program here, helping Australians build, rent and buy. All that is going to be at risk if the member opposite becomes the leader of our country. Thanks, Speaker.
Call to the Honourable the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. Can the Acting Prime Minister confirm that state Labor governments have entered into contracts to extend the lives of coal-fired power stations into the 2040s?
I'll hear from Order. I hear from the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, contracts entered into by the federal government or between the state and the federal government would always be in order, but I'm not sure how any minister here is meant to be responsible for contracts that states undertake that have no connection with the Commonwealth.
The question didn't go to the responsibilities of the government or the acting Prime Minister. It's more of an awareness question. Well, I haven't finished, so just cool your jets for a sec. What I'd like to give the Deputy Opposition Leader a fair go is to maybe just rephrase it so it is the responsibility of the acting Prime Minister, because if we open this box up, you'd have quite a long bow then that you could ask any leader regarding what a state government had done or hadn't done. And obviously I want to make sure that all questions are within order and everyone gets a fair go. So perhaps if we could rephrase the question just to make sure that it is within the responsibility of the acting Prime Minister, so it can get through. Give the call to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the acting Prime Minister. Given the government's responsibility for the national energy market, which includes coordination with state Labor governments, can the acting Prime Minister confirm that state Labor governments have entered into contracts to extend the lives of coal-fired power stations into the 2040s?
Order. Order. That question is within order. And the Minister for the Environment and Water has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I'm not sure why the Deputy Leader thinks that our responsibilities only relate to dealing with state Labor governments. Of course, the Commonwealth Government would always deal with governments, whether they are state Labor governments or state coalition governments, in the same manner. But on the question of delays, keeping coal and gas power generation going longer, the biggest reason to keep coal and gas power generation going longer is the expensive 20-year delay proposed by those opposite, which is the fantasy nuclear energy policy they have. Mr Speaker, the biggest risk is a nuclear energy policy that, by their own admission, won't be operational for 20 years and then will only provide 4% of power. And it will cost $600 billion, and it will add $1,200 to the average person's household bills. The other thing that I think is worth saying, Mr Speaker, about the delay that those opposite would cause to the energy transition is 1.7 billion extra tonnes of carbon dioxide would be released into our atmosphere if those opposite get their way and delay the transition by 20 years.
The Minister will just pause. She's straying into alternative policies, but I'll hear from the... I just want to make sure that for the remainder of her answers she's not talking about opposition policy because she wasn't asked about opposition policy. So just as the question had to be relevant, I'm going to make sure that the answer is relevant as well, directly relevant.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The reason that state governments are contemplating having to extend the life of any of these stations is because those opposite were warned that 24 coal-fired power stations were closing. And what did they do in response to those 24 coal-fired power stations that gave their closure dates to those opposite? They did nothing. They did absolutely nothing in response to the delays that were telegraphed while they were in government. They had 22 separate energy policies. They didn't land a single one. Of course, we're having to double down to move more quickly because of the delay and dysfunction that we inherited. And that's the same position the states and territories are in.
Has the Minister completed her answer? Has the Minister completed her answer? Yeah. Call to the honourable member for Aston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. How is the Albanese Labor government boosting productivity and investment in our economy? What alternatives are there?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The member for Aston knows that Australians are under pressure, and that's why every member of this government is focused primarily on the cost of living and getting inflation down. And that's why progress has been so important. Inflation was 6.1, as the Deputy Prime Minister said, now more than half, back in the band for the first time since 2021. Underlying inflation is moderating. The Reserve Bank's lowered their forecast for inflation. When we came to office, real wages were falling substantially, now growing 4 quarters in a row. The gender pay gap has narrowed as well. 1 million jobs have been created. Unemployment still in the low 4s. Participation is at record highs, Mr Speaker. And our economy has continued to grow while most of the OECD has had 1 or more negative quarters of growth. Every taxpayer is getting a tax cut. We're rolling out cost of living relief, and we've delivered 2 budget surpluses for the first time in almost 2 decades and saved $150 billion in Liberal debt. Now, we've done all this, Mr Speaker, without the support of those opposite, but also without losing sight of the bigger structural issues in our economy at the same time. We do have that primary focus on the cost of living, but we're also focused on making our economy more productive. We had seen the weakest decade for productivity growth under those opposite in more than half a century, and we want to turn that around. Not with their approach, which is to make people work longer for less, but with our approach to boosting competition in our economy, building a more skilled workforce, harnessing data and digital technology, delivering care more efficiently and maximising the benefits of the net zero energy transformation. Now, this government already has a big and ambitious agenda when it comes to productivity, but we also made 3 new announcements in the last week alone. A $900 million productivity fund with the states to incentivise economic reform, a new single front door for major investors to get capital flowing more effectively in our economy, and PC inquiries for each of the 5 pillars of productivity to help inform the next steps. And we'll have more to say about productivity and investment in and around the Investor Roundtable on Friday and the Treasurer's meeting the Friday after that, Mr Speaker. Now, Australians know our priorities are cost of living and inflation, budget repair and investing in the future. But they also know that they will go backwards if this opposition leader unleashes his risky and reckless arrogance on the Australian economy. I'm asked about alternatives, but we are deep into the 3rd year of a 3-year parliamentary term, and they still have no costed, coherent or credible economic policies. And with that, Mr Speaker, is it any wonder that in a profile piece in the Saturday paper, when the colleagues over there were asked about the Shadow Treasurer, they said that he had, quote, vacated the field. They said that he had no, quote, clear, defined direction. And they said that he is, I quote, just throwing rocks, Mr Speaker. The time has come to come up with alternatives, to cost them and then put them forward. Otherwise, we will conclude, as your colleagues have.
Call to the honourable member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question goes to the Acting Prime Minister. Frontier Economics has revealed that the Albanese Labor government's renewables-only plan ignores key costs, including billions of dollars in so-called sunk costs for projects yet to commence and for which the Australian taxpayers still have to pay. Is this the case?
Order. The member for Fairfax will pause. I want to hear from the member for Warringah on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. A point of order under Standing Order 100D, where a question must not contain statements of facts unless they can be authenticated. And pursuant to the practice book, it is when a member refers to facts, they must vouch for the accuracy of the facts, not just the reporting of them, but the actual content of the facts being included in the question. So I ask whether or not the member for Fairfax vouches for the facts and figures included in his question.
The leader, I'll hear from the order. I want to hear from the member for Warringah.
I'd ask the Leader of the Opposition to withdraw.
Well, I could see there was an exchange going on, but when someone turns their back on me, I can't hear what they're saying. So, was order. I will decide who withdraws. Will not take direction from members on my right or left. Did the Leader of the Opposition say anything unparliamentary? Order. Order. Had the member concluded his question? I'll just hear from the Leader of the House before we circle back to the member for Warringah.
Yeah, Mr Speaker, just to the point of order, it's one that has been rarely raised but was raised a number of times by the former member for Hunter, Joel Fitzgibbon, during the first term of the Abbott government, and on those occasions the questioners who then when Joel was raising it, it was members of the government, were asked to vouch for what they'd stated.
Yep. I hear from the Leader of the Opposition.
At the invitation of the Leader of the House, I'm happy for you to arbitrate and declare whether this was an unparliamentary or offensive remark. What I said was...
No, Leader of the Opposition...
I'm very happy to oblige.
We're talking about something else.
Very happy to oblige.
The Leader of the House...
Sorry, just to assist, I wasn't referring to anything that you'd said at all. No. If this is the moment of this term when you can say you were happy, we'll take it. But I was referring to the point of order that was raised by the member from that point.
Yeah, I dealt with that, and we've moved on. So we're dealing now. We're dealing with the member for Warringah's point of order regarding the validity of the question, not the other issue that's been dealt with. The member needs to be aware of the standing orders to make sure any member who is raising a question does contain fact. If I was to sit here and to ask for every question to contain proof of everything that was said, it would be a very long question time. We'd be here for hours. The member for Warringah on a point of order.
Just in relation to the standing orders, it is clear that a member can be asked to vouch for the accuracy of the information that they are including in their question. That is pursuant to the standing orders that is in the practice book. And so it is a decision upon a member in framing their question to include facts that they are comfortable to vouch for their accuracy before the parliament.
I'm just going to listen to the question again, because he made reference to a report. I just want to make sure it is within standing orders and following. So I'll listen to the question carefully.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question went to the Acting Prime Minister. Frontier Economics has revealed that the Albanese Labor government's renewables-only plan ignores key costs, including billions of dollars in so-called sunk costs for projects yet to commence and for which the Australian taxpayers still have to pay. Is this the case?
So I'm going to allow the question because he's referring to a report. I haven't read the report. I'm unaware of the accuracy, but if a member of parliament refers to a piece of work, a news article, a piece of work, I assume that it is an accurate report. So the member for Warringah on a further point of order.
It's simply asking for the member to vouch for the accuracy of the facts that he is reporting. That is what the standing orders provide. Because once it is on the record, it is assumed as accurate. So it is simply asking for the member to vouch for the accuracy of that information.
Resume your seat. We're going to move forward because any member of parliament could announce, including a member of the crossbench, reference a report or, and if I was to simply sit here to ask for every report to be verified, and I assume, given that this report's been announced, every single member and everyone watching across Australia will now check the accuracy of that, and I would hope that in any world that it wasn't accurate, the member would have to come back to and apologise to the House if he has misled or said anything inaccurate. Give the call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, the short answer is I don't accept the assertions which have been contained in the question that's been asked by the honourable member. What we see around the world is that the cheapest form of electricity today is firmed renewable electricity.
On my left.
And if you go to any developed economy on the planet, they are investing in firmed renewable energy. That is how the world is walking down the pathway of decarbonising. That is how modern nations are engaging in the economic transformation which puts them at the frontier of technology. And that is what this government is going to navigate as well, and is doing so through increasing renewables in our grid, through increasing investment in the renewable sector. Now, the series of questions, Mr Speaker, that we have had from those opposite makes it plain for every Australian to see that this is a party which is opposed to renewable energy. What is absolutely clear is that this is a party still wrestling with itself and the Nationals about whether climate change is actually happening at all. This is a party which is stubbornly and determinedly refusing to move with where the planet needs us to go, needs governments to go. It is an opposition which is refusing to acknowledge the conversation which is happening in Baku this week, as it has happened each and every year, about transitioning our globe and facing one of the great challenges in our lifetime. Now, we are going to do that because we understand the importance of Australia's contribution to reducing global emissions. But more than that, what we understand is that a fair and efficient transition in terms of decarbonising our economy is what is in the nation's economic interest. And that is what we are pursuing, and we are doing that by pursuing the cheapest form of energy out there, which is firmed renewable energy. Now, those opposite, and the member in particular, are out there championing, along with the Leader of the Opposition, an idea of pursuing nuclear energy, which we won't see for 20 years, which is the single most expensive form of energy on the planet, which will see an increase in household electricity bills of $1,200, and when it's all said and done, might contribute 4% to our electricity grid. Well, those opposite can be completely stuck in the past when it comes to these policies, as they were for an entire lost decade, as we saw 22 different energy policies which took this country nowhere. On this side of the House, we have intent, we have a direction, and we are transitioning this country to a cleaner, better, more prosperous future.
Call to the member for Werriwa.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to give more people from the outer suburbs the opportunity to go to university? How does this differ from other approaches?
Call to the Minister for Education.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank my friend, the wonderful member for Werriwa, for her question. Mr Speaker, today the Senate is debating legislation that will wipe $3 billion of HECS debt for more than 3 million Australians. This is the bill that fixes that spike in HECS indexation that happened last year. It wipes that out and it makes sure that this never happens again. And it is the first step in making HECS fairer.
Manager of Opposition Business.
The next step is what we announced a couple of weeks ago. If we win the next election, we will cut all student debts by a further 20%, for 3 million Australians nationwide. And both of these things help with the cost of degrees. If we win the next election, we will also reduce the amount of money that you have to repay in your HECS debt every year. So, for example, for someone on $70,000 a year, this means that you'll pay about $1,300 less a year than you currently have to. It means more money in your pocket, not the government's. It means more help with cost of living. But, Mr Speaker, we also have to do something about the cost of a lot of kids missing out on the chance to go to university at all. Now, today, almost 1 in 2 young people in their 20s and 30s has a uni degree, but not everywhere, not in regional Australia and not in the outer suburbs of our big cities. I know, as a kid growing up in Western Sydney, that for a lot of my mates, university just seemed too far away. It seemed like somewhere else for someone else. And part of fixing that is bringing university closer to them, closer to where people live. And that's what university study hubs do. We've already got more than 40 in regional Australia, and where they are, they work. More people sign up for a degree, more people finish a degree. And now, for the first time, we're going to put them in our outer suburbs. On the weekend, I announced the locations of the first 10. Broadmeadows and Epping in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, Melton in outer western suburbs of Melbourne, Macquarie Fields in south-west Sydney, Kurri Kurri just out of Newcastle, Elizabeth north of Adelaide, Sorrel just outside Hobart, and Armidale, Ellenbrook and Mandurah in the outer suburbs of Perth, and Strathpine just a couple of 100 metres up the road from the opposition leader's office in the outer suburbs of Brisbane. This is all about building a better and a fairer education system. It's all about helping more kids from the outer suburbs and the regions to get a crack at university, and there's more to come.
Call to the Leader of the Nationals.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture. Given the cyclical nature of the cash flows of farming, can the Minister explain, under the Albanese Labor government's changes to superannuation concessions, will a farmer who has their farm held in a self-managed superannuation fund have to pay tax on unrealised capital gains on that farm? And will that tax be payable when they have had a failed season with no income?
Order. Order. We'll hear from the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, just drawing attention to the policy carriage of that with a different minister.
Order. Order. No, we're just everyone. We're just going to take it one at a time, and we'll hear from the
It is a central agency that has determined that, Treasury, but it would have been at the behest and the advice of all the departments, including the Department of Agriculture, of how a farmer would in fact pay for this. I would have thought that is prudent governance.
The Attorney-General is warned. I'd just like to give everyone a fair go when they raise their points of order. We've done that. The Minister is now going to get the call. She's happy to answer the question, and we'll go forward that way. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for that question. As the member knows, the government is targeting tax breaks and superannuation to make them fairer, particularly for individuals with super balances of more than $3 million. And all Australians will continue to receive their tax concessions to help them save for retirement. Can I say that all superannuation funds, including self-managed funds, are required to have sufficient liquidity? That's already a principle and requirement of our current superannuation system. So, under existing superannuation law, funds are required to have some liquid assets to meet any existing and prospective liabilities, cash flow requirements and expected tax concessions and consequences of their investments. Individuals can choose how they pay their tax, Mr Speaker, either out of their superannuation account or from their own pocket, and this is similar to other parts of the superannuation system.
Order. The House has come to order. We'll hear from the member for Wills.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Skills and Training. How is the Albanese Labor government supporting Australians to get the skills they need by removing financial barriers to training, and is there any opposition to this?
Give a call to the Minister for Skills and Training.
Thanks, Speaker, and I thank my friend, the member for Wills. Unfortunately, the Minister for Education dealt with alliteration earlier for his question. Labor is providing cost-of-living support for more Australians to access high-quality, affordable training to help them get good, secure, well-paying jobs. Our Free TAFE initiative is delivering the training Australians want and the skills that we need for them to get ahead. Last week I was in Western Australia, and on average students there are saving over $2,700 for a Cert 1 qualification or better with fee-free TAFE this year. And I was at Bentley TAFE with the member for Swan,
There I met Kayla, a single mum, one of the thousands of Australians benefiting from free TAFE. For Kayla, not having to find the money to cover course fees means she's got the opportunity to upskill. She's been working in kitchens most of her life, but now with her kids in school, she wants to get a qualification towards a career she can do for the next 20 years. This is a really big deal, Speaker. Kayla told us what she was telling her kids. I'm going to school to get a better job so we can have a better life. Now, I was asked whether there is any opposition to this. Shockingly, there has been opposition. The Liberals continue to call fee-free TAFE wasteful spending. Now, under them, Speaker, Australians like Kayla working hard to create a better life for themselves and their families would be worse off. Last time they were in government, we saw the damage that their disregard for the vet system had done. They left Australia with the worst skills shortage in 50 years. They ripped $3 billion from TAFE and training after a decade of reckless neglect. And we know that the Leader of the Opposition is a big risk, because we know his record. He's opposed every single one of our cost of living measures. And what's more, he's refused to back additional fee-free TAFE and vet places for construction. Likewise, expanding access to new energy apprenticeships, expanding capacity for training facilities and the trainer workforce, support for women's careers in vets, and increased financial supports to priority apprentices and their employers. Speaker, we can't risk the Liberals limiting access to vocational education and cutting off pathways like free TAFE. Under them, Australians would be excluded from opportunities to upskill and make the contributions that we need, meaning the experience of older workers would be lost because they wouldn't have the chance to train for new careers. Housing and energy projects would be forced to look, wouldn't get the skilled workers they need, and business would be forced to look overseas for workers instead of employing Australians at home. Now, the Leader of the Opposition's reckless arrogance has real costs for Australians. His agenda is wrong for Australia, and he's wrong for Australia too.
Give the call to the honourable member for Fowler.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Given that the Labor member for Fairfield, who should have a voice in government, has resorted to protesting against his own Labor government with placards on social media to secure a long overdue upgrade for Carramar Station in my electorate of Fowler, what commitment do you have to ensure our community in south-west Sydney receive its fair share of Commonwealth infrastructure investment, noting that the Metro line through Fowler was cancelled by state and federal Labor?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you to the honourable member for her question. My colleague, the Infrastructure Minister, reminds me that we're investing an extra $2 billion in infrastructure in Western Sydney. An extra $2 billion of investment in infrastructure in Western Sydney. And that's because if you look around, the members on this side of the House from Western Sydney, they come here and represent their communities with enthusiasm and with great success, making sure that in a budget which has some pretty serious fiscal constraints, we still find the room to invest billions of dollars in one of the most important communities in our country and one of the most important parts of our national economy. And we will continue to make those kinds of investments in Western Sydney, whether people are waving placards around or not.
I call the member order. Before I call the member for Dunkley, I'm also pleased to advise the House that the Honourable Terry Stevens, President of the South Australian Legislative Council, is joining us today. And I give the call to the honourable member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. How will the Albanese Labor government's legislation for social media age limits support families and promote safer and healthier outcomes for young Australians?
Call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. The Albanese government understands the deep concern of many parents about the harmful impacts of social media, including screen time addiction on their children. And they've told us that they want help managing their children's use of social media. and this is why we are progressing this legislation. This is about helping families, when they are sitting around the kitchen table, to have the hard conversations about accessing social media. Mr Speaker, our laws will enable parents to say no. The normative value is immense. But, Mr Speaker, this is not about government telling parents how to parent. It's about getting kids back out in the playgrounds and on the sporting fields. And this aligns with what we are hearing from experts. We know there are benefits for young people from accessing social media, but we also are hearing about the hazards of excessive use. In 2022, a group of UK psychologists and neuroscientists analysed longitudinal data on 17,400 young people, and they found that young girls experience a negative link between social media use and life satisfaction when they are 11 to 13 years old. And for young boys, it's when they are 14 to 15 years old. Mr Speaker, this legislation will help relieve some of these pressures for young people, the fear of missing out, the infinite scrolling and the addictive features. Now, the government appreciates the views that have been advanced by young people and mental health advocates. We know online environments can be an important avenue for young people to connect and to find their tribe. And we know the harms don't go away when someone turns 16. And that's why last week I announced the Albanese government's intention to legislate a digital duty of care. It will place a legal obligation on the platforms to take proactive steps to protect their users. This is landmark reform recommended by the independent review of the Online Safety Act. Our decision to legislate age limits for social media also builds on the changes I introduced to the basic online safety expectations in May this year. These changes mean that platforms are required to place the best interests of the child at the core of their services. Now, Mr Speaker, I know the challenges of online harms is something that everyone in this House would be concerned about, and that's why we are looking forward to working with all members to deliver this critical legislation for age limits to access social media.
Give the call to the honourable member for Banks.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications. Australian parents were shocked to hear the Minister for Communications state on November 14 that Snapchat could be exempted from the government's social media age limits legislation. Snapchat has wreaked havoc on Australian families, often with devastating consequences. Will the Albanese government reverse course and guarantee that Snapchat will be included in the law?
Call to the Minister for Communications.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Mr Speaker, the government's made it clear that under this legislation there will be a broader definition of social media to what is currently in the Online Safety Act. Defining an age-restricted service is a new legal term, and we've been clear that the definition is likely to capture what is commonly understood to be social media. The framework will be clearly stepped out for the public and the Parliament when it's introduced.
Give the call to the honourable member for Solomon.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is for the Acting Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government working with our partners to deepen cooperation and expand military exercises to contribute to the security of our Indo-Pacific region?
The call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the member for his question and acknowledge his distinguished service. Yesterday, along with the member for Solomon, I participated in the 14th US-Australia-Japan Trilateral Defence Ministers meeting, along with US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin and Japanese Defence Minister Gen Nakatani. There is no country with whom we have more in common, with whom we have a greater strategic alignment than Japan, which is why we have seen that our strategic and defence relationship with our old friend has developed rapidly over the past few years. And part of what we have in common is that for both of us, our most important relationship is with the United States. We are both American allies in the Indo-Pacific. And so this gathering of the three countries was profoundly important for Australia. It is a gathering which is based on practical, real action. Secretary Austin's visit to Darwin was the highest-level visit of an American official since President Obama visited Darwin in 2011 to announce the marine rotation. In 2018, Prime Minister Abe visited Darwin, but we understand that the visit of Minister Nakatani is actually the first visit of a Japanese Defence Minister to Darwin, which carries with it a poignancy. This was a historic gathering, and it was a gathering that was carried with weight. And the outcomes of this were as significant as any of the previous trilaterals. Yesterday, we announced that Japan will now make regular deployments of its amphibious rapid deployment brigade to Australia, with a particular focus of not only working with the Australian Army but also with the US Marines as part of their rotation. Japan will also participate in Talisman Sabre 25. Now, this obviously builds the familiarity, the interoperability between our respective defence forces, but it sends such a powerful message about how our three countries are making a contribution to the collective security of the region in which we live, and we are asserting the rules-based order within the Indo-Pacific. We also agreed that our three countries will commit to consulting with each other on regional security issues and contingencies, and that means that our three countries will coordinate and cooperate on contingencies from conflict through to responding to natural disasters. Our three countries are the deepest of friends, and yesterday was an affirmation of our enduring commitment to each other.
Call to the Leader of the Australian Greens.
My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. At the Global Climate Summit, the UK announced a 2035 emissions reduction target of 81%, along with a ban on all new licences to mine coal. Despite promising Australia's target by February next year, the Prime Minister is now ducking and weaving on a pre-election climate target while approving 28 new coal and gas projects and lifting emissions higher than under Scott Morrison. Why won't you announce a new climate target that builds on the UK's ambition instead of opening new coal and gas projects?
Call to the Minister for the Environment, the Minister for Water.
Thank you, and I thank the member for his question. It contains, of course, an inaccuracy right at the centre of it, and that's the number of coal and gas projects he's pointed to. We have approved 10 times more renewable energy projects than coal projects. 10 times more renewable energy projects than coal projects. But on to the specific question about the 2035 target, can I reassure the member that the Climate Change Act that he voted for included within it a limitation that says that the Climate Change Authority must provide advice before a 2035 target can be included. Now, that was an amendment to the bill that was proposed by this side. It was an amendment that was proposed by the member for Warringah, and it was voted for by the Australian Greens political party. So that legislation that we passed enshrined both our national targets under the Paris Agreement and a process for determining the 2035 target. And that process, as I say, was voted for by you at the time, not by you, Mr Speaker, but by the Australian Greens political party. And it was also welcomed by the member for Ryan, who said at the time, "We welcome the requirement that the Climate Change Authority once again advise on emissions targets." So, Mr Speaker, the explanation for the member's question is that we're awaiting advice from the Climate Change Authority that's considering the important issue of setting a 2035 target, which will be both ambitious and achievable.
Call to the honourable member for Gilmore.
My question is to the Minister for Financial Services. What is the Albanese Labor government's plan to protect Australians from criminal scammers? Are there any alternative approaches?
Call to the Assistant Treasurer and the Minister for Financial Services.
Thanks, Speaker, and can I thank my friend the member for Gilmore for the question. And I know that from Bomaderry to Bateman's Bay, from Kiama to Ulladulla, she's working hard to keep her constituents' money and their information safe. Speaker, we've introduced legislation into this House, and it is no exaggeration to say when passed it will make Australia the hardest target anywhere in the world for criminal scammers to make a dollar. We will literally have the toughest scam prevention framework anywhere in the world. It will ensure that there is a significant uplift in prevention required right across the economy. It will be the toughest and hardest legislation anywhere in the world because it will apply to banks, to social media companies and to telecommunications companies. It will require them to prevent, detect, disrupt and respond to scams. It will provide victims with a pathway to compensation. I'm asked what are the obstacles to this legislation passing and us keeping Australians' money and information safe. Well, frankly, Speaker, it's the indifference of the opposition, their indifference to this as a problem. And we know that under the Leader of the Opposition's watch, scam losses doubled every year since 2016. They doubled because the Leader of the Opposition was weak and soft on criminal scammers. He was weak and soft on criminal scammers. Australians were a sitting duck, and frankly, this is the approach that they are persisting with in opposition. I'm asked why I make that statement because this morning, when the Leader of the National Party was presented with a very simple question, will you support Labor's legislation, he responded that they did not yet have a position on this. Well, Speaker, you're either on the side of the criminals or you're on the side of Australians, and you're on the side of the Albanese Labor government who is keeping Australians safe from these criminals. Under Labor,
the Leader of the Nationals.
Scam losses have reduced. They reduced by 13%. The only country in the world that can make that claim. The only country in the world that can make that claim. Well, the clock is ticking. We could pass this legislation in this fortnight. $7 million a day. $7 million a day. That is how much Australians are losing. You can say in this parliament this week, I'll stand on the side of Australian consumers and I'll pass these laws, or you can continue to be weak on the criminal scammers. You can't be strong in the telly and weak in parliament. Pass these laws, back Australians.
Just remind members and ministers to direct their comments through the chair. Call to the honourable member for Hume.
My question is to the Acting Prime Minister. Recently, the RBA has said underlying inflation has eased further across advanced economies, more so than Australia. Interest rates have fallen in the United States, Britain, New Zealand, Europe and Canada, but not in Australia. Isn't the reckless spending of this weak and incompetent Albanese Labor government fuelling homegrown inflation?
Order. Give the call to the Treasurer. Members on my right. Treasurer has the call.
It's my only chance to get one from him, Mr Speaker, to jump up at 5 minutes to midnight on question time. Mr Speaker, if the Shadow Treasurer, wants to make international comparisons, let's make international comparisons. If Australia was to measure core inflation the same way that the US and the UK does, ours would be lower. And if he wants to talk about movements in inflation around the world, he should be honest enough to say that inflation just went up in the US and it went up in Europe as well. And if he wants to make international comparisons about inflation, he should fess up and say that our services inflation is lower than the UK and the US as well. And while he's at it, Mr Speaker, he could fess up and say that our inflation here peaked lower and later than the countries with which he compares us. And while he's at it, he could point out for the House, he could concede for the House that interest rates are higher in the US, in the UK, in New Zealand. They're still higher than they are in Australia, and they went up by more. And while he's at it, Mr Speaker, he could probably fess up to the House while he's on a roll that unemployment is higher in a number of the countries with which he compares us. And so the point that I would make again, for the very slow learner who's under heavy attack from his colleagues in the Saturday paper on the weekend for having no direction and no coherence and no idea, and this is what they mean by it. When his colleagues are bagging him in the paper, this is what they mean by it. Because Australians know that when this government came to office, inflation was more than double what it is now. When this government came to office, real wages were falling. Now they've been growing for 4 consecutive quarters. They know that when this government came to office, there were deficits as far as the eye can see, and we turned 2 big Liberal deficits into 2 big Labor surpluses, something they were unable to do in almost a decade in office, Mr Speaker. Now, we are under no illusions about the pressures that people are under, but we also say that any objective observer looking at the Australian economy would acknowledge the progress that Australians have made together since the hole that they were left in under those opposite when we came to office, Mr Speaker. So I say to the Shadow Treasurer, try and get a question at the business end of the pack, if you can, and try and ask me a question, Mr Speaker, because every time he jumps up here and asks these dishonest international comparisons, he leaves out the key facts, and that is precisely why his colleagues behind him are speaking to the Saturday paper about a Shadow Treasurer that only throws rocks, that doesn't have any direction, that doesn't have any coherence and doesn't have any costed economic policies 3 years into the term.
The call to the honourable member for Macon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. How is the Albanese Labor government making medicines cheaper for all Australians, including providing Australian mums and newborn babies free access to important vaccinations? Why are cheaper medicines such a high priority for the Albanese government?
Call to the Minister for Health and the Minister for Aged Care.
Thank you, Speaker. I thank my friend for that question because he knows we have one of the best medicine systems in the world, and he promised at the last election to make it even better and, importantly, Mr Speaker, to make it cheaper. And in a bit over 2 years, we've made 250 or more new or expanded listings to the PBS, giving Australians access to some of the world's best treatment at affordable PBS prices. But we've also listed new vaccines on the National Immunisation Program, Mr Speaker. 12 months ago, we introduced the most comprehensive protection program against shingles, and since then, more than 1.6 million older Australians have received the new Shingrix vaccine. Before then, they were paying $560 each, but now they get it for free, saving older Australians $900 million in just 12 months, Mr Speaker. And last Sunday, as the member indicates, I announced another world-leading vaccination program, this time protecting little babies against RSV. RSV, Mr Speaker, is the leading cause of hospitalisation for babies. An average winter will see around 12,000 babies put in hospital, a quarter of whom will spend time in the intensive care unit. But now pregnant mothers will have access to a new, highly effective vaccine to take in their 3rd trimester, which will give them protection, but importantly give their newborn babies protection for several months in their new life. And usually that would cost the family $300, Mr Speaker, but now it will be completely free. And all states will also now provide a backup protection for families who haven't taken the vaccine before birth by giving them a treatment when the baby is born in the first few days. Now, Catherine Hughes, this terrific founder and director of the Immunisation Foundation of Australia, who joined me at the announcement of this program at the Women's and Children's Hospital in Adelaide, Mr Speaker, said this. She said, "This is a monumental milestone for preventative health and makes Australia a world leader in RSV protection, Mr Speaker. This new program is going to cut the annual hospitalisation of babies through RSV of 12,000 now by more than 10,000. 10,000 families who will be relieved of the trauma, the stress, the anxiety of their precious newborn babies, usually only a few months old, who are hospitalised in their first few months, all while helping relieve the enormous pressure that we know our hard-working public hospitals have through respiratory illness during winter. Our government is absolutely committed, Mr Speaker, to listing new medicines, to listing new vaccines, and we're committed to making them cheaper, because we know that's not only good for their hip pocket, it's importantly really good for their health as well.
Give the call to the Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
Before we go to papers, the member for Fairfax has indicated he is seeking the call on a misrepresentation.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. During question time—
Do you claim to be misrepresented?
Yes, I do, Mr
You may
Speaker.
proceed.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. During question time, the member for Warringah challenged the validity of a question I had put to the Acting Prime Minister, in which I had referred to a Frontier Economics report, and I quote from my question, billions in so-called sunk costs for projects yet to commence.
Just need to explain where you were misrepresented, but I'll hear from the Leader of the House.
This has started with a misrepresentation of what the member for Warringah said. You can't claim to be misrepresented and then open with a misrepresentation, which is exactly what she's done.
Just order. We're going to do this in an orderly way. The member for Fairfax is entitled to claim. We'll come to the member for Fairfax in a moment. Just a member for Warringah in a moment. You need to claim quickly where you've been misrepresented and to demonstrate why that's so.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To demonstrate where billions in so-called sunk costs for projects yet to commence was reflected in Frontier Economics report. The report says—
I'll handle this. I don't need to be explained what the report says. You simply need to say the member for Warringah claimed this. This is the actual—
Seeking to do, Mr Speaker.
Don't be bullied by this guy.
Order. The Leader of the Opposition. Yeah, we're just going to— we can get through this if everyone ceases interjecting and everyone follows the standard practice. The Leader of the House.
So I've got the call?
Yep.
So in terms of stating a misrepresentation, the first part is to state what the other person has claimed. Now, the only thing he has attributed so far to the member for Warringah is something that the member for Warringah did not say. She simply raised a point of order asking the member to vouch for what he had said. Now, that issue was resolved a different way under your ruling at the time. You can't then— the member can't now use a statement of personal explanation to try to revisit where he was not misrepresented in any way. And the only way he's been able to concoct a misrepresentation is by misrepresenting what the member for Warringah said.
Order. If the member can claim very quickly where he was misrepresented, you don't need to read the report out. Just state whether the member had— you believe the member had misrepresented you, and then if you wish to table a document, which I can see there, you may proceed, but just get to it quickly.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The member misrepresented me due to— excuse me, I'm addressing the Speaker.
Order. Members on my right, this cuts two ways. There's plenty of members who wish to claim— we're not going to have this. You're not going to interrupt while someone is claiming a misrepresentation. We're not doing that. The member's going to continue and be heard in silence, or ministers will be asked to leave.
The member had challenged the validity and veracity of the information I put in the question to the Acting Prime Minister, and therefore, to assist the House, I offer to table that report, which includes mentioning of $62 billion, which is not accounted for.
That's right. That's right. Is leave granted? Order. Member's entitled to do that. Is leave granted?
Of course leave's not granted. The whole concoction there was based on a dishonest statement.
All right. The member has— is use the form of the House, which is entitled to do under the standing orders, as any member is entitled to do. The member for Warringah on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. The member for Fairfax has misrepresented the point of order that I made during question time. I asked whether or not, pursuant to the standing orders, he would vouch for the accuracy. He did not stand up and vouch at that time. To come up now after question time is a misuse of the standing orders. Again, it was entirely in his purview to vouch at the time I raised the point of order.
The member has raised her point. We're just going to keep moving because there are a number of valedictory speeches we'll need to get through this afternoon. The member for Mayo.
Mr Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 105, I request that you write to the Minister for Aged Care seeking reasons for the delay in answering my question in writing number 664, asked on the 12th of August 2024, and there's 9 parts to that question. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I shall write to the Minister as the standing orders permit. And I'll just table report before we get to the Leader of the House. I present the following Auditor General's Audit Report for 2024-2025. Number 12, Performance Audit, Management of Conflicts of Interest by Corporate Commonwealth Entity Boards across entities. And number 13, Performance Audit, Implementation and Award of Funding for the Growing Regions Program, Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communications and the Arts, Department of Industry, Science and Resources. Now, the Leader of the House with papers, patiently.
Speaker, these documents are tabled in accordance with the list circulated to the honourable members earlier today. I also present the supplementary explanatory memorandum for the Aged Care Bill 2024. Full details of the documents will be recorded in the votes and proceedings.
And on indulgence, I give the call to the honourable member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. When asked about what they're learning, the children at Ewing Kinder, Malvern East and Windsor Childcare Centre cite Caring for Country. They appreciate the teachings from traditional owners of this land, as do I. When elected in 2022, I knew that politics had a shelf life, but I didn't expect mine to be this short, well before my best-by date. The seat of Higgins, established in 1949, was flagged for abolition a mere 2 years into my term. It is named after Justice Henry Bourne Higgins, who became a peace activist after the loss of his only son in World War I, who raged against the